Welcome. Next is the final round of Big Questions debate. Big Questions is a debate format supported by the generous grant from the John Templeton Foundation. And over the past 3 years, Big Questions debate has had 50,000 students at over 1,600 events debate topics on the intersection of science, philosophy, and theology. Over these 3 years, almost $1.5 million has been granted to these Big Question debate events, thanks to the John Templeton Foundation. The NSDA is excited to announce the continuation of Big Questions debate for 3 more years with their generous support. We invite you to participate and host your own Big Question debate events at your district tournament with your team as a scrimmage or in your classroom. Thank you once again to the John Templeton Foundation for making this all possible. We do have a live polling element to this debate. To join, please download the Guidebook app and the Nats 19 guide. Once you have downloaded the Nationals guide, go to the schedule for today and click on the Big Questions final round session. Within the session, you'll see the live poll. Once the round begins, it will become active and you'll be able to answer the questions. If you would like to be entered in a drawing for one of 4 $250 scholarships, enter the code word scholarship for the first question and submit your responses by the end of the round. Middle and high school students are eligible to enter. You must be present when we announce your name at the end of the round in order to win. Before we begin, I would like to thank Ms. Adeswa Amarui, who helped me in tab all week. Now to introduce our final panel of judges. These judges will help us award a $5,000 scholarship to the runner-up of this final round, and a $10,000 scholarship to our national champion in Big Questions. Our first judge, Ms. Molly Bruins, Sapphire coach from St. Mary's High School in Oregon. Brother Anthony Kavitz, 5-diamond coach from Catholic Memorial School in Massachusetts. Mr. Matt Marr, quadruple Ruby coach from Ashland High School in Oregon and president of the Oregon High School Speech Coaches Association. Mr. Bill Prater, 2-diamond coach from Whitmer High School in Ohio. Mr. David Watkins, 6-diamond coach from Greenville Technical Charter High School in South Carolina. Miss Lisa Weber, 1-diamond coach from Interlake High School in Washington. And last but not least, Mr. Scott Woods, 1-diamond coach from Basis Scottsdale High School in Arizona. Finally, please welcome our 2 competitors, Q105 on the affirmative and Q164 on the negative. Good luck.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank some people. I'd like to thank the John Templeton Foundation for making their generous donation to make this debate possible. I'd like to thank the NSDA for giving us the platform to speak our own voices and speak our own minds. I'd like to thank my mom and my dad and my 2 brothers, Christopher and Laird, and my cousin Austin for helping me get here. And I'd also like to thank all the coaches that helped me over the years, Walker Perkins, Tillman Hewitt, David Gardner, Andrew Garcia, Tasha Jones, and Julian Erdman. Thank you so much, all of you. Without further ado, I'll begin the affirmative case. Because I agree with former Vice President Joe Biden when he said, "Don't tell me what you value, Show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value. I stand in firm affirmation of today's resolution. Resolved. Humans are primarily driven by self-interest. I begin by offering two clarifications to structure the debate. First, according to Black's Law Dictionary, the word primary means first. Second, the word self-interest means the pursuit of widely shared goals. This presents the best possible definition for debate and investigation, as Jason Whedon and Robert Kurzban of the University of Pennsylvania explain in 2017. The equation of short-term interest with material short-term interest is too restrictive. It's preferable to ground notions of self-interest in widely shared goals, to focus on goals with tangible implications. Short-term economic goals fit the bill. Goals are genetically selfish and involve competitive aspects that have been biologically relevant. Humans are generally motivated to advance outcomes among themselves, their relatives, and their own social networks. Thus, it is the burden of the affirmative to prove that human beings are motivated to advance our own goals before taking into account other considerations. It is not the burden of the affirmative to prove that human beings are driven only by self-interest or only for personal survival. Rather, to win the debate, the negative must provide some evidence that another goal usually comes before self-interest. I have three contentions to prove this resolution. My first contention is that Price's equation proves that even altruism is in self-interest. According to Dr. Wim Horjic, an evolutionary biologist in 2016, in biology, altruism is defined as an individual performing an action at cost to itself but benefits to another individual without expectation of reciprocity. George Price, an American physical chemist in mathematical genetics at University College London, derived an equation that provides a formal method for the effects of natural selection. If the covariance between trait and fitness values is positive, the trait will move upward. Now, this may seem trivial, but it provides a formal quantitative description of how selection works, not only in biology, but in economics or learning, for example. And second, it shows that what really matters is statistical association, not just genetic relatedness. This expansion provides insight into the evolution of altruism, as according to the Price equation, altruistic traits can only evolve where the positive between-group covariance makes up for the negative within-group covariance. Mathematics tell us that altruism is a product of evolution. In the end, it still serves a selfish purpose, whether it is at the level of the gene, the individual, or the group as a whole. Price's research teaches that altruistic tendencies only increase when they improve the ability of social groups to function. A mother may not receive direct benefit from raising her children, but she will tend to try her best since it supports the growth of her family over the long term. Altruism is not a selfless act of love, but a selfish biological imperative for groups of people to survive. This means that every example the negative gives of altruism evolved solely out of self-interest. Now, contention 2 is that people are primarily driven by self-interest because they respond to incentives. Don Boudreau, the co-director for the Mercatus Center of Public and Economic Policy at George Mason University, writes in 2013 that people who do not like the conclusions of economic analyses challenge the assumption that human beings are self-interested. A person is self-interested if he or she cares more about him or herself and close loved ones and friends than strangers and acquaintances more distant. Now, Beckett asked a prison inmate about information, and the inmate sneered, "Why should I answer you?" Everyone understands that people respond rationally to incentives. The inmate had nothing to gain. A critic would be laughed out of a job if they were to write, "Silly crime show writers, they assume people are rational. We all know human motivations are far more complex. Why would someone want to kill the victim?" Questions such as these justify the assumptions that economists make about human motivation and behavior, because we all, in every facet of our lives, make the very same assumptions. Since humans are primarily motivated by incentives, or carrots and sticks as economists like to call them, we can see that people will seek to pursue their own goals in a process referred to as self-interest. Contention 3 is that humans are primarily driven by self-interest as we aim to satisfice with our decisions. This means that before applying high-level decision-making skills like empathy, justice, and fairness, we try to meet a minimum that will satisfy our self-interest. In March of 2009, Gustavo Burros modernized the words of 1978 Nobel Prize-winning economist Herbert Simon, writing that Simon strived to build a theory of human behavior. Every behavior involves a selection, be it conscious or not. Now, efficiency dictates that choice, which produces the largest result for the given resources. The formulation is the principle of bounded rationality. The capacity for the human mind for solving complex problems is very small compared to the real world. The decision maker has egregiously incomplete and inaccurate knowledge about consequences and chooses actions that are expected to be satisfactory. The attempt to empirically study decision making was done through lab experiments and computer simulation. The key is the replacement of the goal of maximizing with the goal of satisficing, finding a course of action that is good enough. Decision makers, instead of trying to maximize values, aim at satisficing. They search for alternatives that are good enough according to some pre-established criteria. The decision maker satisfices if he or she chooses a satisfactory alternative. Thank you.
Okay, so before I begin, I'd also like to thank some really important people that have been instrumental in getting me here. So first, again, I would like to thank the John Templeton Foundation for exposing us to this new form of debate and so generously sponsoring it for the NSDA for at least so many years. And second, I'd like to thank the NSDA, and in particular the Dallas hosting committee, for running such a smooth tournament and giving us the voice to express our opinions and explore avenues that many other students don't have the opportunity to. And next, I'd also like to thank the hotel and the staff for putting in so much effort to accommodate for all these needs for a ton of new people. And next, I'd like to thank my coaches that have been helping me get here over the years, starting with Mr. Holland, Ms. Leito, Ms. Smith, Mr. McCaffrey, Ms. Moreno, and Ms. Metropolis for supporting me and giving me all the resources and staying on late weekends for this ridiculous time-taking event. And then next, I'd like to thank the Plano ISD School District for supporting and monetarily and from an administration perspective for this event, because I know that I come from a program that not many others can equate to, both from a support level and on a monetary level. So I just like to express, again, how generous I am for this. And again, I'd like to thank the Plano West debate team members, especially my friends, Michelle for helping me prep, and then you guys in the audience, MK, Nihar, Edison, and Brandon, who's not here. I know I'll have to buy you guys dinner eventually. And then last but not least, I'd like to thank my parents and my brother who are here in the audience here today. You guys stay up long nights for me. You wake up early. You always pray and encourage me through everything. And after debating this topic, I now know more than ever how much of a sacrifice you've really put into doing this for me. And I cannot thank you enough for all of that. And so with that in mind, I'd like to begin the negative case. Are all my judges ready? Joe Biden also said that I'd do anything for Obama, and I think that he would for me. This is a family thing. Because I agree with him, I negate resolved, humans are primarily driven by self-interest. Let's start with some key definitions and framing. First, Merriam-Webster defines primarily as originally, just like my opponent does. Therefore, we must consider one's primary conscious intent when they choose to take an action, rather than obscure motivators. This is the most fair way to evaluate the round and provide the most ground for both sides to engage in a logical discussion. Dr. Neil Burton continues in 2012 that there can be no altruistic act that does not lead to some degree, no matter how small, of pride or satisfaction. Therefore, an act should not be written off as selfish or self-motivated simply because it includes some inevitable element of self-interest. However, the act can still be counted as altruistic if the selfish element is accidental, secondary, or undetermining. Second, the Random House Dictionary explains self-interest as pursuing one's personal interest or advantage, especially when pursued without regard for others. With these two definitions in mind, my first contention is parenting. Psychotherapist Philip Chard in 2012 writes that being a parent is a largely selfish act. One must frequently subordinate one's own needs to that of the child, and parents are there for their children, not the other way around. As a parent, you dedicate years of your life to raising a child and dealing with any consequences that come. If so many people are willing to do so and have a child, then there is no possible way that self-interest could be the most heavily weighed driver. Jeffrey Kluger of Time magazine explains in 2017 that it's not just the physical toll that childbearing takes on the body of the mother, but also the price that both parents have to pay, and sleepless nights, constant worry, and long hours spent on the job to pay for it all. Cortisol, a stress hormone, is present in much higher levels in parents, which can weaken the immune system, raise blood pressure, and otherwise tax one's health. In addition, parents prioritize their children's needs over their own in every single situation. A study by Anglicare in 2017 found, in an analysis of adults who use emergency food relief, revealed that parents skip meals far more frequently than their children, cut down meal sizes, and were willing to starve themselves so that their children could eat first. Considering that Humanium finds there are 2.2 billion children worldwide, and that the overwhelming majority of humans in the world were raised by parents at some point, it is obvious that humans act altruistically in the most important facets of our decision-making. Contention 2 is the compellingness of compassion. Subpoint A is biology. Individuals are motivated by compassion and empathy because they genuinely enjoy helping others. Dr. Keltner of Berkeley in 2004 finds that in research by neuroscientists, participants were given the chance to help someone while their brain activity was recorded. Helping others triggered activities in portions of the brain that turn on when people experience rewards or experience pleasure. Oxytocin is a hormone that promotes long-term bonds and commitments, and the kind of nurturing behavior, like care for offspring, that lies at the heart of human compassion. When people perform behaviors that are associated with compassionate love, their bodies in turn produce more oxytocin. Thus, Emma Seplow of Psychology Today in 2013 concludes that science shows that we are actually wired for compassion, not self-interest, and decades of clinical research on human suffering has shed light on a bright side. Human suffering is often accompanied by beautiful acts of compassion by others wishing to help relieve their sufferings of their peers. For instance, in a recent Colorado school shooting, high school senior Kendrick Castillo lunged at the gunman, giving other students enough time to get to safety. This example and many more indicate that we biologically are driven by an innate desire to help others. Subpoint B is our emotions. Emotions have a far stronger control over decision-making than any long-term logical considerations for one's self-interest. A study conducted by Princeton University in 2004 concluded that impulsive choices or preferences for short-term rewards from the emotion-related parts of the brain win out over the abstract reasoning parts that decide our self-interest. Factors other than pure reasoning often drive people's decisions. Our emotional brains have a hard time imagining the future, even though a logical brain can clearly see the future consequences. If humans were indeed primarily driven by self-interest, then self-interest should be the strongest factor when considering decision-making. However, this is not the case in reality. For example, 2 studies prove that my case is true. First comes from Rivas of Danberg of the CER, who shows that in a study about human compassion, people were more likely to give up their own money to alleviate the suffering of their peers, even when they were the ones with the financial advantage. In the end, we can see that humans, no matter in what circumstance, are willing to sacrifice their own needs and in turn are willing to help others before they even think about themselves. I urge you on the negative to consider a more positive side of human survival, because this is the side that happens in reality, whereas he offers you a cynical worldview that isn't applicable to our individual and intrinsic human desires. Thus, I negate.
Ready for crossfire?
Yeah.
All right. So would you be willing to prove that humans are primarily selfless by me conceding this round and you giving me the top scholarship prize?
I mean, so I would argue that first, I'm not an indication of overall humanity. The round is asking us to consider this in totality. But second, I would say that we already have a lot of the top scholarships. So if this did come down to that, I'd be willing to give you $5,000 if it would prove that I'm not selfish.
Do you have a question? I'll take it. I'll take it, man.
Okay, so my second question is, your argument here is that humans are primarily driven by a desire to survive, and that's why they cooperate, right? Okay,
Right.
So in this instance, why do firefighters run into a burning building so that they can help others?
Right, so I have 2 arguments against this. First is my contention 3, which indicates the reason people sacrifice themselves for others is because they've already reached what's called a satisfactory level of self-interest, right? Just because different people have different levels of satisfaction with their self-interest doesn't necessarily indicate that they aren't satisfying their self-interest
Okay,
first.
so you were arguing that the underlying reason why people are cooperating in the first place is so that they can ensure survival there, right? That's your first contention.
Right, no, it's not to ensure survival. My first contention, the price equation, indicates that it ensures the fitness of the overall species.
So where does the motivation come into play on your first contention?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
So this resolution is asking us to examine the drivers of human actions. Where on your first contention do you prove to me that the motivation for people acting in a cooperative manner is indeed selfishness?
Right, my evidence specifically indicates, using George Price's equation derived in 1973, that mathematics tell us that altruism is a product of evolution.
So so it is a product, not the cause.
Right, it is a trait, right? And
Okay.
insofar as it is a trait, it is primarily driven by self-interest.
All right,
Can I ask a question real quick?
of course.
Let's talk about your parenting example really quickly. Do parents sacrifice as much for their own kids as they do for complete strangers' children?
So you were making an argument that parents are more likely to be compassionate towards their own children. That does not reject the premise underlying that parents are compassionate in the first place. I would argue that people always are to engage in compassionate actions, even to complete strangers. So all you're proving to me is that parents are even more compassionate to their own children, but they are still compassionate to complete strangers.
Right, so you would say they are primarily compassionate to their own children and then secondarily compassionate to others, right?
This is calling into question the definition of self-interest. You're not giving one, but what I'm telling you is that an action is self-interested if you are doing it for yourself without consideration to the benefits of other people. There are 2 ways that parenting does not fit under this definition. First, parenting incurs a cost to oneself in the form of more stress. You have to pay more time to care for your children, and parents are willing to give up their lives for their children. Second, parents are directly considering the needs for their own children, and thus, it cannot be a solely self-interested action under this premise.
Right, okay, where do you say the affirmative has to win that things are solely self-interested?
I don't say that you have to say that they're solely self-interested, but clearly, if a parent is willing to give up their lives and have their children eat first and willing to starve, then this cannot be the primary motivator.
All right. I'll begin prep time. All right, I'll cease prep time. I've used 55 seconds. That means I have 2 minutes and 5 seconds left. All right, I'll just be attacking my opponent's case. Is everyone ready? My opponent argues that self-interest means disregard for others, but this definition is flawed. You should prefer my definition of self-interest as widely shared goals for 2 reasons. First, their definition is from a dictionary, which is not reliable in the field of human motivation as my definition, since it comes from the Pennsylvania Laboratory of Behavioral Psychology. Second, my definition is the most predictable because it represents how scientists have historically studied human evolution, while theirs, as I said, is contrived out of a dictionary. Now let's talk about this underlying argument they make that only conscious motives matter in their framework. This is wrong for 3 reasons. First, it's a contradiction with my opponent's second contention, since the amygdala and the oxytocin produced by it is subconscious. That would mean only the neocortex, i.e. the conscious part of the brain, would apply, which means their second contention, if they win their observation, doesn't apply. Now second, extend my opponent's definition of primarily as originally. This means we must find the starting point for human drives. Price's equation proves with 100% accuracy that our original motivation, i.e. what created us as humans, was self-interest. Now third, if only conscious decisions matter, my third contention proves that people consciously pursue self-interest to a threshold of what's called satisfaction, and then they go on to perform higher order functioning. Just because we help other people doesn't mean we are primarily driven by helping other people. Let's go to my opponent's first contention about parenting. My opponent says that parenting proves that humans are not primarily driven by self-interest. This is wrong for 3 reasons. First, you can extend my first contention. Parenting is an extension of the self. Insofar as parents care more for their own kids than kids of random strangers, you're going to see that self-interest is taken more into account than my opponent's evidence assumes. Now second, people have children because it fulfills paternal and maternal drives that are rooted in self-interest for continuing the longevity of populations. My contention 1, the Price's equation, indicates that these motivations are literally wired into our brain because we have a need to continue evolution, right? If we didn't choose to have children and want to have children as a species, our species would cease to exist. This means that regardless of the outward-looking motivation, the inward meaning of this motivation is the continuation of our species. Now, the third reason is that you can extend my third contention. All my opponent has proven here is that parents have a lower level of satisfaction than other people. For example, like I said, parents aren't going to sacrifice themselves for kids that they don't even know. Parents tend to sacrifice themselves for kids that they identify with. This proves to you that it is rather rooted in self-interest instead of other interest. Now let's go to their argument on the second point about, or let's go to their second contention about biology. First, this proves that the oxytocin argument, I've answered it above, but it also proves that people only act compassionately to produce what's called oxytocin in the brain, right? This indicates that people are acting this way because it causes self-interest. Oxytocin makes me happy when I cooperate with other people, so therefore I will continue to do it. This is a form of operant conditioning that we will continue to use insofar as it benefits us. Now my second argument is that this is only after they are satisfied with their own self-interest. You can extend my contention 3 here that we will help others in almost all cases after we've satisfied our own self-interest. I'll get more into this in the next speeches. Now let's go to my opponent's subpoint B about emotion. This just relies on anecdotal evidence regarding people who jump in front of school shooters. This is not necessarily going to apply to everyone because it is based on inductive rather than deductive reasoning. Their arguments make hasty generalizations based on specific events rather than deducing conclusions based on observations in the field. Secondly, my opponent argues that we try to create what is called an emotional balance. That emotional balance that their evidence is identifying is only striven towards because it is in our self-interest to be emotionally balanced, right? This is the same argument as the oxytocin. People strive to have their self-interest, i.e. we want to be emotionally balanced, therefore we act emotionally.
Which now? 130 is used. So the order in this speech is going to be first starting on general definitions, going down the negative case, and then going to the affirmative case. Are my judges ready? Let's start on the definition level. Both sides agree that we should be looking to the original intentions behind a person's action. Here's where his logic is flawed. He's applying the word originally and primarily to the wrong word of the resolution. The resolution is asking us to consider the original and primary drivers for people's actions, not the original humans. For this reason, disregard his evolution argument here because he's completely misinterpreting the purpose of this question in the first place. But then, he's trying to ask us to look towards these studies on his definition from the University of Pennsylvania. He's trying to, again, not look at our motivations, but the actions themselves. I say that you should prefer the definition that I'm giving to you because the evidence I read in case from Dr. Neil Burton. Burton says that in order to examine the primary motivations, we can't consider any secondary benefits like maybe getting a tiny amount of pleasure out of an action, but look at the real reasons and the neurological reasons why a person does something. I would argue that is our emotional and that is our love. But then, the next response he reads is that The next response he reads is that, on my contention about parenting, is that parenting is self-interested because people care about their own children more than complete strangers. That doesn't deny the underlying premise that parents are still caring towards everybody, just towards some people towards other extent than other people. That's still a reason to vote for the negative here. The second response here is that parents only parent so that they can pass down their genes. That is an affront to any parent in this room right now who loves their child. I would argue that not a single parent in the entire world thinks 50 years down the line after they pass away that their child and their lineage is going to continue on. But in the moment, they only consider that they love their child. That is why the Anglicare evidence finds that parents have such a great love for their child that they are literally willing to starve so that their kids can eat first. But then, he tells us that parents are only don't care about complete strangers. I would argue that's patently false because people still choose to donate money to charities and help homeless people on the street. But in addition, parents still care for people, even if they are sterile. A parent doesn't immediately stop loving a child the moment they can't have children, but because they have a bond with each other, that still occurs. But then finally, parents are adopting other kids as well, which have literally 0% chance of passing on their own genetics. He's going to come up here in his next speech and say that parents only care about adopting when they can't have children themselves, but a US Bureau census shows to you that 50% of the people who adopt are actually those who already have biological children too, showing that the interest in passing down genes is not even a single slight motivator in parenting's actions. On my second contention, he only responds with his own case, and I'll address that on the side. Let's go to his case for a moment. His top observation is that every single goal is a human action and is self-interested. That boils down to the logic of people do things, therefore that means everything is self-interested. This is an incredibly abusive definition because it leaves with absolutely no round to engage in his arguments anymore. Everybody has goals, but we have to examine whether in this round, the motivation behind those goals are self-interested or altruistic. Therefore, that's the only way we can look at this round. But then on his first contention about Price's equation is only an empirical study that doesn't look at the motivation of humans. But what Herjic in 2016 of Live Mathematics does, criticizing Price's study, says that people must incur a personal cost to themselves in order to benefit the group first. For example, a firefighter has to run into a building so that he can save everybody else. There is no more benefit towards himself that can be occurred after he passes away and sacrifices his own life, but everyone else lives on because of the price that he paid. The second response, I would argue, is that people continue to help strangers, showing that Price's effect doesn't occur because there's no way a stranger that you never see again is going to reciprocate these benefits. And finally, he has the complete wrong view of evolution here. People didn't one day automatically realize that cooperating would help them survive better, but rather, the people who had a natural predisposition towards being cooperative were the ones that were selected. Therefore, even though it is evolutionary true that most people are altruistic today, that's just another reason to vote for the negative here, because that shows that us alive, who have survived together and cooperated in groups, are the ones that make up the portion of humanity. Let's go to a second contention about incentives. What Cruz of Forbes in 2017 finds is that the carrot and stick model has been disproven by decades of research, but rather in the corporate workplace, people prefer models where they respect and have mutual relationships with their coworkers, and that's where they're most productive. On his third contention, prefer my second contention because emotions act faster than their logical reasoning does, showing that these are the real motivators.
All right, are we ready? You argue that people are naturally predisposed to cooperate because it is in our self-interest. How is that not?
That is absolutely not what I said. What my argument is that people did not one day realize that cooperating was going to help them survive. In the beginning, some people were selfish and some people were altruistic. What Price's equation proves is that the people who are self-interested did not succeed in evolving and therefore they passed away. But what the evidence that I've given to you proven says is that the real motivation and the real way that evolution works from a perspective is that the people who are altruistic were just selected because they had a better chance of surviving.
So let me make sure I understand your argument. The reason people are altruistic is because we're more likely to survive.
Let me re-explain it one more time because you haven't understood yet. What I'm saying is the reason why people survived was because they're altruistic. It is not that the reason why people are altruistic is that they can survive. You are taking the conclusion and then lumping it in with the motivation, but this round is asking us to examine the reason why people do things. Can I have a question now?
Sure.
Okay, so every single action that I take has a goal, right?
I would say so, yes.
Okay, so the most important action that a human can do with their life is the one that determines the fate of their own life, right?
I don't think that's necessarily true, right? We can act for causes that are bigger than ourselves, i.e. that is still a work of self-interest. For example, if I go to fight for my country, I am fighting for my country based on the identification with that, right? I'll give you
Okay,
easier
but
example.
fighting for your country is still giving up your life, correct? So so let me rephrase my question. The most important decision that a person can make is the one that determines the fate of their life, correct?
Not necessarily.
Okay, so the military example you give me is literally an example of a person deciding what to do with their life. Can you give me any other ones?
Right. I'm not sure I exactly understand your question. My argument is just that people only give up their life insofar as they identify with causes, right? I might give up my life for the United States, but I will certainly not give up my life for the army of Venezuela.
Okay, so
right? This proves to you that we work with others and we give up for others insofar as we identify with them.
So if the cause is love, is that self-interested?
If the cause is love, well, I'd have a couple arguments against that. First, love is created through the biological hardware I talk about, which is through price equation. Second of all, I say that we act to satisfy our own self-interest, and then we can do things like higher order function, right? Compassion.
Before I let you get to the third one, your second one is contingent on you winning your framework of goals, correct?
Right. The first and third contention do not rely on winning the framework of goals.
Yeah, I understand. Did you have a third response?
Okay, sure. Why should we only worry about conscious motives when it has been scientifically proven that subconscious motives do exist?
Okay, so you were arguing to me that subconscious motives exist, such as oxytocin. Oxytocin is not the motivator for actions. I do not consciously think about how much oxytocin I'm going to be releasing in terms of milligrams every time I take an action like hugging my mom. That's ridiculous. The real motivation that people do is they think on an emotional and logical level. So that's why we should see that emotions act faster than the physical or logical parts of our brain do.
I'll start prep time. All right, 1 minute and 30 seconds used. That means I have 35 seconds remaining. I'm just going to be going over the main voters in this round. This round comes down to what motivates people. Do we know everything that motivates us or not? I will identify in this round that we do not consciously make decisions on everything that motivates us. There are 3 reasons you're going to prefer this. First, my opponent's own contentions prove that oxytocin released by the amygdala is a subconscious response, but it still drives us to action, right? I don't know how much oxytocin was produced by my amygdala when I gave my mom a hug, but I do know that it felt good, so I'll probably do it again. Now, second, extend my opponent's definition of primarily as originally. This means we must find the starting point for human drives. Insofar as I'm winning my third contention that I would like to remind you was dropped in the last speech, you have to evaluate even if you are evaluating conscious drives, we have to satisfy a satisfactory level of self-interest first. I'll get more into this on the line by line, but let's talk about the major arguments my opponent made against my definition of self-interest. They say it looks at actions. My definition looks at actions rather than motivations. But this doesn't take into account the fact that we have motivations that cannot be specifically measured in asking people, right? If I ask if I ask my opponent why he was motivated to win this round, he will never tell me it's because of self-interest. Everyone in this room knows that that's true, right? This proves to you that you don't have to asking questions and asking conscious motivations don't always prove the truth of the matter. Now, this also answers my opponent's baby's argument. No matter how, and it is definitely true that parents genuinely love their children and genuinely care for their children. Now, the reason that's true is because we have been genetically predisposed to care for our children, right? If it wasn't an evolutionary necessity to care for our children, we wouldn't have that exist. That's why you see many, many other species not taking care of their children, because it's not an evolutionary necessity for them. But rather, since it is for us, we care about our children. Again, I'm not saying that there isn't a genuine care for children, but rather that genuine care comes out of an evolutionary necessity as identified in Price's equation. Now, that's the first vote you're voting on today. The second one is that my third contention was entirely dropped in the last speech. Now, this explains that people are primarily driven by self-interest because we aim to satisfy us with our decisions. This does not mean that everyone has the same level of self-interest, or that those levels even stay exactly the same. For example, a debate coach is satisfied with a much lower level of self-interest than a Fortune 500 company CEO, right? We are then able to give of our time and money to other people more because we have a lower bar for satisfaction. My argument isn't that everyone wants their self-interest all the time. My argument is that you have to satisfy a level of self-interest that you are comfortable with before you can help others. Thank you.
Over time. "40 seconds used in addition to the 130 before, so that means I have 50 left. The order is going to be first starting on the framing level, going down my case, the negative, and then going to the affirmative. Is everyone ready? Let's start on the framing. The main conflict here comes between whether we believe a motivation can be conscious or unconscious. My opponent says that they can be unconscious, but I say that they should be conscious. The reason that you prefer this definition is because if something is so insignificant that it is literally an unconscious motivator behind our actions, I would contend that there is no possible way it can be the primary driver of why we act, but rather, he knows that I want to win this round for XYZ reason, and he can identify to you what it is. He claims it is self-interest. I'm claiming to you it is emotions. That's why you instantly prefer my second contention over his argument. This is going to lose him the round for the next half for this reason, because the Princeton evidence that I cite to you from my case says that the emotion-related parts of our brain think way before any logical considerations do. Nobody thinks in terms of how much oxytocin they're going to be getting. That's the long-term and logical part of our brain thinking there, but rather the emotions act first, because every time that someone sees someone that they love, they instantly elicit a response to them, and it causes them to act in an emotional manner before that they act in any self-interested manners. But the second piece of context is the definition of self-interest itself. He says that self-interest can still be actable if someone has a group goal. That doesn't align with what my dictionary definition says. I'm arguing that an action is altruistic and therefore not self-interested if it comes at a cost to the individual but benefits someone else. This is the most widely accepted definition, even though his niche author disagrees with him. Prefer mine because it is the best way for the actual intention of this resolution to get debated. Let's go to my first contention of parenting. He extends two responses in his last speech. First, that we are genetically predisposed to care for our children. While this may be true, it still doesn't account for the reason why parents adopt children and still help other people even though we know that they're never going to see us again. Genes don't think, but our emotions can because they are the ones that are driven by our brain. That's why you're going to prefer my motivation of love over his of self-interest, because there's no way that biological code in our genes is going to think on the same level that our neurons do processing in our brain. The second response that he extends is that parents are getting more satisfaction for caring for their children, but that doesn't respond to any of the evidence that I've read in my first speech. What the Kluger evidence says is that parents experience more physical stress, are less happy, and are suffering more over time for caring for their children. That is a definite cost to oneself that is going towards someone else. The fact of the matter is, on the Anglicare study, that parents love their children so much and are willing to sacrifice so much that they will starve and stop eating so that their children can be benefited first. Prefer this argument over every single one of my opponents for two reasons. First, the most important decision a person can make with their life is the one that determines the fate of it. Since a parent is willing to sacrifice themselves and give up everything for someone else, clearly self-interest is not the motivation, but a care for others and general love. The second reason why is because it takes out every single one of his arguments. Let's look at his case for a moment. He tells you in Price's equation that people desire to benefit the total group, but he never addresses the Kerjic evidence that says that the actual motivation here is altruism, because people have to sacrifice in order for the group to benefit first, and therefore, under his third contention of satisfaction, a person in the future will have zero satisfaction after they have given up their own lives. That shows that satisfaction is not the most important thing, but is a secondary motivator behind all the love that we have.
All right, I have 35 seconds remaining. I'll start it now. All right, that is time. I'll just be going over the main voting issues again. My opponent argues that only conscious motives matter. Again, this is not true. In fact, my opponent's second contention, they state that oxytocin is released by the brain as a response to cooperation. This proves to you that subconscious motives can activate action. For example, like I said, I know that when I give my mom a hug, it feels good. That doesn't necessarily mean I am giving my mom a hug to produce oxytocin in my brain, right? My argument is that there is a level of conscious that can access things that are subconscious, like oxytocin. That doesn't necessarily mean we understand all of them, but rather that we understand a preliminary level. Second, my opponent has continued to not answer my third argument that I made here. This just proves that my third contention is true, right? Higher order functioning, such as empathy, cooperation, love, only exist insofar as we have a satisfied level of self-interest. My opponent comes here to argue that that emotions come before satisfaction. That's just not true, right? There is a level of emotion that is based off of self-interest, i.e., I want to feel happy, therefore I act in myself. I do things that I think will make me happy. And there's a different level of things like love, compassion, and empathy. Those are not emotions, but rather more developed, higher order functions in the neocortex. The emotions that my opponent are identifying come from the amygdala, which is not the most important way we make decisions, but rather the neocortex. So even if my opponent wins this conscious versus unconscious debate, that's a reason you vote for the affirmative. Now, let's get down to the bounded rationality argument. My opponent argues here that people will satisfy themselves after acting emotionally or after helping their children, right? This is fundamentally not true. My argument here is that people can die happy. My opponent says that when you die, you have no satisfaction. That's just not necessarily true. The fact that people can die happy people proves to you that we can actually create satisfaction out of driving for our self-interest, right? Insofar as I identify with the United States, I might go and fight for my country, and even if I die out there, I know that I was helping my own group. right? I know that I was helping increase the inclusive fitness of the United States of America. That proves to you that people are willing to make sacrifices for their group insofar as they identify with them. Again, as I said before, Venezuela, this is not the same thing. I would not sacrifice myself for another country in the same way I would countries that I specifically identify with. Now, the final argument I'm going to make here is that satisfaction does not and primary drives are not necessarily our only drives. For example, I am primarily satisfied by a scoop of chocolate ice cream, but by the time I'm eating my 65th, I'm probably not having a good time. This proves to you that people can be satisfied with primary drives that don't necessarily carry on to their final decision.
I'll take running prep. So I'm going to be starting on the framing one last time, then going to my case, and then going to his. Is everyone ready? Let's start at the top level of framing. The reason why he instantly loses this round is he does not extend a definition of self-interest into his last speech. That means that you instantly have to default to mine. The definition from Merriam-Webster says is that an action is only self-interested if it is done without regard for other people and it directly benefits yourself. Parenting is the antithesis of self-interest for this reason. My case is extremely simple. Whether you consider it from a conscious or an unconscious level, humans are still motivated by love and compassion and not self-interest. He gives you a lot of emotional anecdotes, but let's look at the evidence from the experts. What my evidence from Kluger says is that the stress hormone cortisol is released in parents. In addition, they have to act every single day to care for their children and subordinate their own needs to theirs first. Parents care for their children so much that according to my Anglicare evidence, which is the nail in the coffin for his entire case, that parents are willing to starve themselves first so that their children can have food before them. He makes two responses in his last speech. First, he says that people can die happy. Even if this is true, there's no way that you can gain more happiness after you have sacrificed your own life, showing that clearly satisfaction is not the reason why people love. But the second reason why I am still going to be winning this argument is because the magnitude of giving up your own life is so selfless that it's going to carry out and outweigh every single one of his arguments. Maybe it is true that people are motivated on some level by satisfaction, but the far stronger driver in terms of the real reasons why people act are on their brain. Emotions are driven by our logical decision, are driven by the neurological motivators here. Let's take a look at my second contention, which is a second clear way that I'm winning this round. My Princeton evidence on my subpoint B of emotions say that the short-term emotional parts of our brain outrule the logical parts. This is very clear. There are two reasons why this is the case. First, our emotional brain acts faster than any logical parts, that is thinking about conscious pleasure. Oxytocin is not a motivator, but it is the end result of our actions. Clearly, it's not the driver and not what our resolution is asking us to do. The second reason is because Princeton furthers that even when our logical brain and our emotional brain are thinking together at the same time, our logical brain does not win out even when it knows what would be the most self-interest for us. A firefighter, when he rushes into a burning building, does know the fact that there's a likely chance that he will die, but his emotional part, his compassion for complete strangers, which he will not have any genetic relationship to and is unlikely to see in the future, wins out. Why? Because humans are motivated by love. Let's go to his case here. The reason why he cannot win any of this is because he doesn't address the prerequisite arguments on my case. He doesn't go for his first or second contention in his final speech, so let's take a look at his third of satisfaction. Every single action may produce a small amount of satisfaction, but in this round, we are not asked to assess the actions that people take. We are asked to assess their motivators, and thus we have to consider whether the reason why someone does something is because they have compassion or because they have self-interest. And clearly, under my definition, the only reason that can explain why a parent is willing to starve themselves and die for their child is because they love them and they don't think about any of the consequences that may occur. Parents don't think about their own happiness, they think about their children. Good debate.
Over the past 3 years, Big Questions Debate has had 50,000 students at over 1,600 event debate topics at the intersection of science, philosophy, and theology. Thanks to the generosity of the John Templeton Foundation, the NSDA has given almost $1.5 million to speech and debate programs. We are excited that the foundation will generously support Big Questions for 3 more years. You can host a Big Questions event at a tournament, school scrimmage, or classroom event. Please welcome President Wyckoff back to the stage to congratulate the finalists. Your winners in the 2019 Big Questions Debate are tied in 4th place. Semi-finalists receiving a $2,500 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation. David Dotson from Vermilion High School in Ohio, coached by Devin Snook, and Chloe Kennerson from Reno High School in Nevada, coached by Christy Briggs. Both received $2,500 scholarships for tying for 4th. Your semifinalist in 3rd place, receiving a $2,500 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation, Cameron Green from Regis High School in New York, coached by Eric DiMichele. Placing 2nd and receiving a $5,000 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation is the Affirmative Daniel Liang from Plano West Senior in Texas, coached by Robey, Holland, and Kattie, Leito. And your champion, receiving $10,000 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation and winning on the Affirmative, John Henry Stearns, Tuloso Midway High School in Texas, Tasha, Kneis, and Linda Esquivel, the coaches.
Please welcome. Go ahead and give him a hand.